Thank you for tuning into this presentation, which I have called a 2x2 model that finds shared features of need frustrations in basic psychological needs theory, self-determination theory, and the flexstability matrix. It's a presentation that I gave at the 7th SDT conference last year in Holland. And I did that because over the past year or so, I've been writing a book that introduces SDT to a Danish audience, university students and professionals. And in the course of that work, I have come across a number of conceptual issues that I thought I would address in this presentation. And in the course of doing that, I would hope to offer some conceptual clarification. Now, if we start with the need frustrations, and of course everything has been laid out in this work, we know that autonomy is frustrated by control, the need for relatedness is frustrated by neglect, and the need for competence is frustrated by a number of things, and I identify one here, rote learning, the requirement that you learn this one particular thing. Now, if we consider these need frustrations, we may ask, how are they similar or different? Shouldn't there be some sort of regularity or predictability to these frustrations? But control and neglect and rote learning, how are they similar? That's kind of hard to figure out, unless, of course, you consider some additional need frustrations, and I line them up like this, that autonomy, well, that's certainly frustrated by control, but also in a sense by permissiveness, the attitude that allows a child to be just everything and too much, really. Relatedness is frustrated by neglect, which is, I don't care about you, you can do whatever you want, but also by contingent regard, that is the attitude of a parent to say to a child, if you want my love, you'll have to act or feel or think in this particular way. Likewise, competence is certainly stymied by rote learning, the requirement to be one thing, do one thing, but also if you leave the child to do trial and error and give no guidance, that's just too many opportunities, so that's like too free in a sense. So lined up in this way, the blue column and the red column, we can see there are some shared features, and one we can call open and loose and like free or very free. The other we can call closed or tight or very firm. And of course, conceived this way, we might see them as opposites, simple ends of one scale, one dimension. But we might also recognize that there are desirable or adaptable aspects to each of these two opposites, to be open and free and to be firm and focused. So let's give these opposites some more general name and consider them to be two dimensions. One could be flexibility and the other could be stability. So that flexible, yes, that's obviously an adaptive thing to be, and likewise with stability. So maybe we can see these as not antagonistic, but as somehow mutually compatible. And for that purpose, we can map these two dimensions, as has been suggested by these good people here. We can map them in a system of coordinates with a common origin, 0, and then stability in one direction, the horizontal one, and flexibility in the vertical dimension. And we can divide each axis or each dimension into high and low, and high and low, and that way we obtain 4 cells. A high high, a high low, a low high, and a low low. Now, if we take the need frustrations, it should be immediately apparent that control belongs here, which is very stable but not very flexible. You have to do this particular thing and no other thing. Whereas permissiveness, well, that's being very flexible but not stable at all. You can do all kinds of things. You can be all kinds of things. Likewise, contingent regard, do this one thing and no other thing. So that's highly stable, not very flexible. Whereas neglect is you can do whatever you want. I don't care much about what you do and where you are. So that's very flexible, but no stability provided. Rote learning is something that focuses very much on one thing. So you might call that excessively stable, just as unguided trial and error can be seen as excessively flexible with very little stability added. Now, if we were to give a common name to these three need frustrations, the red ones, what would we call them? Let's call them rigidity. So being fairly rigid, that characterizes this cell, whereas the other opposite, we could call that chaotic or chaos. Too many options, too many possibilities, not enough focus. So in that way, we have made a map, so to speak, of the need frustrations, as I write in the title here. And that conceptualization also makes it possible for us to consider the need satisfactions, because we identified stability and flexibility as something desirable and adaptive. And indeed, if you consider how needs are satisfied, the need for competence is usually its satisfaction is usually called structure or scaffolding, which is helping the child do particular things in particular ways. So there is focus and there is stability, but there's also a room for a little exploration and curiosity and so on. So it's not a rigid thing, it's not a chaotic thing, but it's structure. Likewise, the need for relatedness is often expressed as involvement, which means, well, be close to the child, be there, take interest, express and act in a close kind of way, but not controlling, not clinging attachment, not sitting on the child, not leaving the child completely alone, but being involved in a sort of a flexible and stable kind of way. Likewise with autonomy, how is that conceived, the autonomy support? Well, sometimes as authenticity, which is sort of the state of mind or being where you are stably focused on a few particular things that express your deeper values and sort of your sense of going a particular place in the world, not going all over the place as the permissive or the diffuse or chaotic type of personality would have it, but more a situation of flexibility and stability at the same kind. Now, if you have your needs met in this particular way, that obviously provides or gives flourishing or well-being, or we could call it eudaimonia, to contrast it with rigidity and chaos. And we can use the terms introduced here, stability and flexibility, and argue that, well, we need both, and for both of those we could introduce this term, flexstability, being flexible and stable at the same time. That's how we want our need supports to be, and that may also characterize the state of being described by this particular cell. So in that way, we have given a sort of map, or included in this map, the need satisfaction as well. Now, if you think, well, what about the fourth cell, where there's low stability and low flexibility? I'm not really sure about that. Maybe that's where we start, or maybe that's a place that we regress to if we are being challenged too much. So far, we'll simply leave it as the null case, that we can only talk about instability and flexibility with difficulty, but I certainly won't rule out the possibility that we could locate some particular state of being right there. Now, if we look at this matrix, the flexstability matrix, as I call it, we might use it to talk about some other concepts in SDT beyond the needs. And one obvious set of concepts that can be looked at is this taxonomy of motivation. And you have maybe wondered, as I have, how can it be that intrinsic motivation, extrinsic and amotivation are aligned here in the same dimension? Obviously, intrinsic motivation derives from you and the activity, high intensity, high focus. Likewise, extrinsic motivation derives somehow from something separable or extrinsic to the field of interest, but certainly also high focus and high motivation. And then amotivation, low focus, low intensity, low motivation, how can that be located on the same dimension? Shouldn't they somehow express two different dimensions? And I think the flexstability matrix will allow us to think this differently. As I'm suggesting here are the types of motivation, and I've added some labels to each of those three cells: chaos, rigidity, and eudaimonia. And if we do that, well, it's pretty obvious that intrinsic motivation resides in the cell that describes well-being, and likewise rigidity, that's where we would see external regulation as being played out. And then introjected regulation, well, it's still pretty rigid, but somewhat internalized, so that the rigidities that push us this way and that have been internalized, so they're more inner, but they're certainly pretty focused as well. Closer to autonomy is identified regulation, where identifications may still be compartmentalized and somewhat rigid, but it's closer to sort of a state in between high rigidity and the flexstability of eudaimonia. And further in that direction is indicated by integrated regulation, where the external motivating factors have become completely internalized and integrated within the self in such a way that they become flexible and yet stable at the same time, and can be adapted to various different circumstances, and integrated norms and values can be departed from, and you can treat them in a flexible way according to the particular concept. So integrated regulation is indeed a kind of very flexible and stable mode of being. Now, if the internalization spectrum is placed thus in those two cells, it's obvious that there is a place for amotivation, and that's in the chaotic cell, where if you consider a particular activity, you don't have much focus, you don't have much stability for that. You're easily distracted, you procrastinate, you do other different things, you're amotivated for this particular, you're chaotic in a sense with respect to this particular activity. So your motivation is low, but since it's flexibility and stability we're considering in this matrix, we can look at amotivation as being a scatterbrained, if you will, state of being with respect to the particular activity that we are looking at motivation for. So that's one way of sort of taking amotivation out of that one-dimensional spectrum that is really suitable to external regulation, to intrinsic motivation, but maybe amotivation is something else entirely. Now, that said, we might move on to the next set of concepts within SDT that would seem to be addressed by this matrix. And here I have added amotivation, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation to the four cells, just to remind ourselves what are the appropriate labels for those cells. And let's look at the causality orientations. Clearly autonomous motivation, where volition and personal standards and goals are important, would go here. Controlled motivation is certainly characterized by rigidity. External forces or internalized imperatives characterize this particular way of being. And likewise, the impersonal causality orientation, where the emphasis is on factors beyond the person's control, and the person feels helpless and pushed this way and that by forces whose source cannot be located easily by the person. So the causality orientations, those three, map onto this, or seem to be addressed by these concepts. As does also the question of emotion regulation, of course. Some work here by Ryan Andisi and Wendy Grolnick and Jennifer LaGuardia has put these concepts on the map. Emotional integration, of course, characterizes well-being. Suppressive regulation, where you want to diminish or abandon or suppress one particular emotion and reduce many emotions to one or fewer than that. That whole attitude is characterized by rigidity, just as dysregulation is a chaotic state of affairs where a person is thrown this way and that by the various emotions that come as a surprise and don't sort of, they're not integrated within the self. So emotion regulation has these aspects too. And so does the whole concept of choice, which Barry Schwartz in these publications has outlined as the paradox of choice, that somehow you can have too many choices. If there are 1,000 kinds of cereal to choose between in the supermarket, how can that be good? Isn't that the tyranny of freedom, in a sense, he asks. And well, yes, if you come from a situation where there's no choice at all, then too many choices may seem the obvious, or many choices may seem the obvious alternative, but you can have too many. And as Richard Ryan has said in one place, well, what's characteristic of autonomy is relevant choice. You have 5 or 20 different things to choose between, relevant and meaningful to your universe, to your level of competence, to where you are as a person. Few people can handle 1,000 or 1,000,000 different options, but a few different options that are relevant to where we are. That's what's important, and that's what gives you autonomy. Whereas too many choices is just a matter of chaos, if you will, and that is exactly Barry Schwartz's concept of choice. Of course, relates to the age-old discussion of what freedom actually is. And if you come from a state of affairs that is characterized by tyranny, then freedom would seem to be the opposite. And Thomas Hobbes expressed this in the 17th century, which was characterized by much political tyranny. And he defined freedom as the absence of external impediments to motion, or rather, that was liberty, but pretty much the same as freedom he defined in this particular way. So the absence of constraint, whereas in SDT, autonomy is not conceived of as the absence of constraints, but rather the presence of constraints and obligations and requests that have been endorsed, that have been volitionally entered into by the subject. You can have all kinds of obligations and bonds between people as long as they're accepted by the person, and the person will still be autonomous, although not free in the classical sense of that cowboy riding into the sunset and being completely free of all constraints. So that's a way of conceptualizing these things here. Now, parenting styles is another line of research in SDT, where some concepts have been identified that seem to be expressible in the terms that I have suggested here. These people develop some concepts, some of them coming from Wendy Gornick. The notion of parental control, obviously, is a rigid kind of thing. Permissiveness goes with chaos, and gentle guidance, this notion that you should guide a child ever so gently, is of course also a matter of being flexible, of providing some focus and some centering, but also being open and exploratory at the same time. Some other work by Roth and Asor in particular have identified a number of more specific concepts, and one here is in the rigidity box. Contingent positive regard leads to suppressive regulation of emotions, and they've found also that contingent negative regard leads to dysregulation, which would be predicted or at least identified by the concepts of the flexstability model. And they've found too that the third kind of emotional integration is what is produced by autonomy support, which fits well into this particular category here. Now, moving on to Valorant's work on the passions, it's obvious that harmonious passion goes in the autonomy, and the obsessive passion is a rigid or controlled kind of passion. And we may ask, well, what's a chaotic kind of passion? Well, maybe none really, and the cell I would leave empty here. I don't know whether he is actually, or these people have considered passions. And you may say that, well, passion is an expression of a high focus, high intensity, and that's why it all belongs on the right-hand side of this model, and that's why we don't see any chaotic kind of passion, but we'll leave that there. Another interesting point has been made by Yang and Reeve in their paper on structure and autonomy in learning. Providing too much structure obviously is a matter of rigidity, and I encourage you to stop the video and read this text. I will just point to it right now. Chaos they identify here, and autonomy support and structure is obviously a matter of being flexible and providing the both and that this model invites. And there's some more text here that you're welcome to read. Now, one nice example, or one nice tripartite measure, as these good people have recently identified, is, well, if you provide need support as a coach to your athlete, what you will produce is dedication. If you provide need thwarting or expose the athletes to need thwarting, they will become exhausted. And if your coaching style is need indifference, that will result in irrelevant thoughts and distractions and lack of a focus in the athlete. So these three very nice concepts, need support, need thwarting, and need indifference, express those various combinations of stability and flexibility that one may have when providing need support. Now, one last instance of these dimensions having some usefulness, I would argue, is in psychopathology, where obviously the well-integrated self is this one here that has need satisfactions. The rigid self, if you will, is characterized by internalizing disorders. And I read aloud here: rigid internal standards and punitive structures, internal control, suppressive emotion regulation, and external perceived locus of control is how these authors characterize this particular pathology, which stereotypically, as you know, is the girl with OCD, and equally stereotypically the opposite is the unruly boy who has externalizing disorders, failures of internalization, emotional dysregulation, and impersonal perceived locus of control. Now, summing up, some implications for the needs and the types of regulation that I have discussed here. Well, I have proposed a 2x2 matrix that maps two distinct need frustrations, for example, control and neglect, and has mapped one cell where we find need satisfaction, such as integration. The matrix has allowed us to see that across needs, not specific to any particular need, stability and flexibility may appear to be relevant dimensions to consider. And likewise, across needs, need support lies in providing stability and flexibility, and their absence produces chaos or rigidity. With a lack of stability, we have chaos. With a lack of flexibility, we have rigidity. And again, across needs, I'm proposing a new concept for need satisfaction, which is flexstability, the parsimonious regulation of human energy for integration of thinking and emotion and behavior. And we may indeed ask, is there or not, or have we pointed to, or have we verbalized an underlying structure for human motivation, the challenge of navigating between the extremes of rigidity and chaos, and charting sort of a middle course towards flexible regulation. And this notion of there being regulations, particular trans need or modes, ways of regulating human activity, I would point to as the last point here, that we have identified three types of energy or activity regulation as an additional way of characterizing well-being, so that whatever the particular need we are considering, regulation has to be flexible beyond rigidity and chaos. And this might also be applicable if SDT comes to identifying more than the three currently recognized needs. If there are further fourth and fifth needs, one might predict or estimate or guess that they would also express themselves in such a way that regulation of these needs would need to be flexible for the needs to be satisfied, and moving between these extremes of rigidity and chaos. So thank you for your attention, and I'm adding the point here that slides 6A through E were added after the conference for additional exemplification. Thank you.